My name is Sarah, and I'm 45 years old, and I never thought I would feel such suffocating dread in my own living room. I had just paid my son's bail, thinking his foolish prank was a harmless mistake, but an hour later, the victim knocked on our door. Seeing the tears streaming down that poor man's face while my son stood there with a mocking smirk changed everything. I realized I had to do the unthinkable. Raising my son Jake was never a simple task after his father walked out on us when he was just 3 years old. We had a bond that I truly believed was unbreakable. Jake is 19 years old now, but in my mind, he was still the little boy who used to bring me dandelions from the yard. The shift in his behavior did not happen overnight. It was a slow slide into a world I simply did not understand. He started hanging out with a new crowd of boys who cared significantly more about viral videos and internet clout than basic human decency. I vividly remember sitting at my kitchen table with my older sister, Martha, who is 48 years old. She was always my rock. I poured my heart out to her, explaining how Jake was skipping classes and sneering at my attempts to talk to him. Martha reached across the table, her hand warm over my trembling fingers. She told me that boys his age test boundaries. My name is Sarah, and I'm 45 years old, and I never thought I would feel such suffocating dread in my own living room. I had just paid my son's bail, thinking his foolish prank was a harmless mistake, but an hour later, the victim knocked on our door. Seeing the tears streaming down that poor man's face while my son stood there with a mocking smirk changed everything. I realized I had to do the unthinkable. Raising my son Jake was never a simple task after his father walked out on us when he was just 3 years old. We had a bond that I truly believed was unbreakable. Jake is 19 years old now, but in my mind, he was still the little boy who used to bring me dandelions from the yard. The shift in his behavior did not happen overnight. It was a slow slide into a world I simply did not understand. He started hanging out with a new crowd of boys who cared significantly more about viral videos and internet clout than basic human decency. I vividly remember sitting at my kitchen table with my older sister, Martha, who is 48 years old. She was always my rock. I poured my heart out to her, explaining how Jake was skipping classes and sneering at my attempts to talk to him. Martha reached across the table, her hand warm over my trembling fingers. She told me that boys his age test boundaries, that his impulsiveness was just a phase. I wanted to hold on to the hope that my sweet boy was still in there, but our house felt completely different. The air was thick with unspoken arguments. Every time I heard the front door slam, my stomach would tie itself into knots. I spent countless nights lying awake, agonizing over where I went wrong. The motherly guilt was a heavy, suffocating blanket. Then came the dreadful phone call that completely shattered my fragile state of denial. It was a miserable Tuesday night. At exactly 2 a.m., the shrill ring of my cell phone pierced the dark silence. My heart immediately hammered against my ribs. I fumbled blindly for the phone, my hands slick with sudden sweat. The voice on the other end was strictly professional and entirely detached. It was an intake officer from the local police precinct. He stated plainly that Jake had been arrested. The word echoed violently in my mind. Arrested. My son. The officer rattled off terrifying words like vandalism, trespassing, and destruction of private property. He called it a prank gone horribly wrong. I could barely breathe. I threw on clothes in the pitch dark. The frantic drive to the police station was a blur of neon signs and slick roads. I imagined Jake completely terrified, sitting alone in a freezing cell, crying out for his mother. In my blind panic, I reverted entirely to my most primal instinct: protect my child at absolutely all costs. The local police station smelled aggressively of stale coffee and harsh cleaning chemicals. I walked up to the thick glass window, my legs feeling like solid lead. I identified myself, my voice shaking uncontrollably. The desk sergeant barely looked up from his paperwork as he explained the bail process. I honestly did not care about the money. I completely drained my emergency savings account without a second thought. The money I had meticulously saved was handed over in a matter of stressful minutes. When they finally buzzed the heavy metal doors and brought Jake out into the lobby, I fully expected to see a humbled, frightened boy. I expected tears and sincere apologies. Instead, he walked through those doors with an arrogant swagger that made the blood in my veins run ice cold. He was looking around the room as if he had just won a grand prize, a smirk playing on his lips. He got into the passenger seat of my car without saying a single word to me. The heavy silence was deafening. I gripped the steering wheel so tightly that my knuckles turned completely white. I finally broke the silence, asking him what had possessed him to do something so incredibly stupid and reckless. He just rolled his eyes dramatically, letting out an exasperated sigh. He mumbled that it was just a harmless joke, that people needed to lighten up. He said he and his friends were just filming a challenge for social media, and things got a little out of hand, no big deal. I swallowed the massive lump of anger forming in my throat. I desperately told myself that the shock of the arrest simply had not set in for him yet. I convinced my breaking heart that once we were home, safe in our own familiar living room, the grim reality of the situation would finally crash down on him. We arrived home and I felt a massive wave of exhaustion wash over my entire body. I slumped heavily onto the living room sofa, burying my face in my trembling hands. Jake walked past me and went straight into the kitchen, opening the refrigerator casually. Exactly 1 hour later, there was a tentative, soft knock on our front door. I dragged myself up from the sofa, deep confusion muddying my exhausted thoughts. I cautiously opened the front door and found an older man standing on my porch. His name is Arthur Henderson. He is 68 years old, and he lives just a few streets over from us. He is a retired middle school teacher, a quiet man who generally kept to himself. But the man standing before me in the dead of night was a hollow, broken shell. He was soaking wet from the freezing rain, shivering uncontrollably and clutching something tightly against his chest. His eyes were bloodshot, red, and swollen from heavy crying. I immediately invited him inside out of the cold rain. He stepped slowly into the bright hallway, his wet boots leaving muddy footprints on the rug. Mr. Henderson slowly, painstakingly lowered his trembling arms. In his weathered hands, he held the shattered, splintered remains of a beautifully painted wooden sign. The paint was heavily chipped, but I could clearly make out the engraved name, Eleanor. I knew exactly about Eleanor. She was Mr. Henderson's beloved wife, who had tragically passed away 2 years ago from a brutal battle with cancer. Mr. Henderson had spent the entire last year building a beautiful community greenhouse in the local park, dedicating it entirely to her memory. It was his personal way of coping with the devastating loss. With a fragile voice that cracked with every single syllable, Mr. Henderson explained what my son's so-called prank actually entailed. Jake and his friends had not just trespassed on public property, they had maliciously broken into the memorial greenhouse. They had intentionally smashed the expensive glass panes, cruelly uprooted the rare orchids Mr. Henderson had carefully cultivated, and completely destroyed the wooden memorial plaque. They had actually filmed themselves destroying a grieving widower's sacred sanctuary, laughing and cheering loudly as they kicked down the handmade wooden benches. The hallway started to spin violently around me. The sheer, unadulterated cruelty of it was completely incomprehensible to my mind. This was a malicious, heartless, targeted act of destruction. I looked at the shattered wood resting in Mr. Henderson's trembling hands and felt an actual physical pain gripping my chest, a sharp agony of a mother realizing her own child is capable of true dark cruelty. Then I heard heavy footsteps coming down the wooden stairs. Jake came down, casually holding a can of soda he had just grabbed. He stopped halfway down the steps when he saw Mr. Henderson standing in our hallway. I held my breath. I waited for the overwhelming shame to hit him. I waited for my son to drop the soda can, to fall to his knees, to beg this poor man for forgiveness. Instead, Jake leaned comfortably against the wooden banister. A slow, deeply mocking smirk spread across his face. He actually scoffed. He looked at the broken, weeping old man and had the absolute audacity to say out loud that it was just some stupid plants, that he would pay for the cheap glass when he got his next paycheck. He rudely told Mr. Henderson to stop being so dramatic over a harmless joke. That dismissive, arrogant smirk shattered my world completely. Every excuse I had ever made for his bad behavior evaporated. I looked at my son standing there so proudly, and I did not recognize him at all. The sweet boy who brought me dandelions was gone, replaced by a cruel stranger who found immense joy in the suffering of others. A freezing cold clarity washed over my entire being. The fierce maternal instinct to blindly protect was instantly overshadowed by a profound, undeniable sense of justice and moral obligation. If I protected him now, if I let him sleep comfortably in his warm bed while this devastated man stood here broken, I would be entirely complicit in his cruelty. I would be directly teaching him that his horrible actions had no real consequences, that he could destroy innocent lives and simply hide safely behind his mother's skirt. I turned my attention back to Mr. Henderson. I gently placed my own hands over his trembling ones, feeling the rough, splintered wood of the broken memorial sign. I looked him directly in his tear-filled eyes, my own tears streaming hot down my face. I apologized with every single fiber of my being, knowing perfectly well that my words were painfully inadequate to fix his broken heart. I promised him, with a fierce, unwavering determination that surprised even myself, that absolute justice would be served tonight. I guided Mr. Henderson to a comfortable chair in the living room and marched into the kitchen. I picked up my cell phone from the counter. My hands were no longer shaking. The maternal hesitation was completely gone. I aggressively dialed the direct number for the bail bondsman and then the police precinct. Jake walked slowly into the kitchen, his arrogant smirk faltering slightly as he saw the steely resolve burning in my eyes. He asked me what exactly I was doing. I looked at him, feeling a complex mixture of profound sorrow and absolute strength. I told him straight to his face that I was officially revoking his bail. I told him that I was calling the police to come back to our house and take him away. The color instantly drained from his face, leaving him pale as a ghost. The arrogant swagger vanished, rapidly replaced by the panicked realization of a child who finally understands that the fire actually burns. He started to frantically stammer, loudly pleading with me. He cried out that I could not possibly do this to him, that I was his own mother, that he would go straight to a real jail cell. He frantically promised that he would apologize right now, that he would fix the entire greenhouse tomorrow morning. But it was far too late for empty promises. The frantic words were hollow, driven entirely by the selfish fear of punishment, not by any genuine remorse for the pain he caused. I told him firmly that I loved him, and precisely because I loved him so deeply, I had to let him fall hard. I had to let him face the full crushing weight of the law, the full consequences of his despicable cruelty. I told him with tears in my eyes that I was absolutely not raising a monster, and if it took sitting in a cold jail cell to teach him basic human decency, then so be it. The police cruisers arrived 20 agonizing minutes later, their red and blue lights flashing brightly through the living room windows. The scene was incredibly chaotic. Jake was screaming at the top of his lungs, begging me to stop the officers, crying out that I was betraying my own flesh and blood. The neighbors turned on their porch lights, watching in stunned silence as my screaming son was forcefully placed in the back of the police cruiser for the second time that awful night. I stood alone on the wet porch, the freezing cold rain mixing freely with my warm tears. I forced myself to stand tall and watch him go, carrying the unbearable weight of a mother's entirely broken heart. The long, quiet days that followed that terrible night were undeniably the darkest of my entire life. My sister Martha came over immediately and simply held me on the sofa as I sobbed until I physically could not breathe anymore. She constantly reassured me that I did the right thing, the hardest, most agonizing thing any mother could ever possibly do. I firmly refused to hire a fancy, expensive lawyer to try and get him out of trouble. I made him use the standard public defender provided by the state. Facing the undeniable video evidence of his crime, he had no choice but to plead guilty to all the severe charges against him. The presiding judge did not go easy on him at all. Jake was firmly sentenced to 6 full months in a strict juvenile detention facility, followed immediately by hundreds of hours of mandatory community service. The legal consequences were incredibly severe, but I knew in my heart they were absolutely necessary to save him from himself. It has been 3 long, difficult months since that fateful night. I faithfully visit him every single Sunday afternoon during visiting hours. The young boy sitting quietly across from me in that sterile visiting room is remarkably different. The nasty arrogance is completely gone. He looks tired, deeply humbled, and filled with profound regret. He spends his days writing long, sincere letters of apology to Mr. Henderson, letters that the grieving old man is understandably not yet ready to read, and I honestly do not blame him one bit. I lost my hard-earned savings, I lost my peace of mind for a very long time, and for a terrifying, brief moment, I truly thought I had lost my only son forever. But in making the absolute hardest decision of my entire life, I truly believe I saved his soul from darkness. I forcefully dragged him off the terrible path of cruelty and forced him to face the harsh reality of personal accountability. Reflecting on everything that has happened, the greatest lesson I learned is that true love sometimes requires delivering the hardest blows, and protecting someone from the consequences of their actions is the fastest way to destroy who they're meant to be. Would you have the strength to do the exact same thing in my place? Until the next story.